even though I think a lot of people think that Buddhism is about like taking up less space and kind of retreating from the world. So there's this kind of irony and this tension between meditation and what people often think meditation is all about, and this idea of no, this can actually help us show up more fully, more authentically, with more compassion, which I think is an incredibly important part of confidence. Is how do we actually show up with compassion? So there's this sense of like, almost there's an image or a metaphor of like claiming your spot at the center of your own life when you take your meditation seat. I mean, I'm not really into monarchy personally. I prefer democracy, but that idea, like, what is the image for us where we can say, I'm claiming my spot, and this is the spot I sit in to show up fully with dignity and with confidence in my life, right? If we
Welcome to the Mindful Rebel podcast, your refuge for personal growth. We're all on a journey to reconnect and nurture the most authentic parts of ourselves. And in this podcast, we explore how these modern day rebels are using mindfulness to transform themselves and the world around them. Each episode will dive deep into personal interviews with social impact healers, teachers, creatives, and leaders. Through their stories and insights, you'll engage with powerful teachings to spark your mind, prompts to ignite your reflection, and techniques to integrate wisdom into your daily lives. Make sure you like, subscribe, review, and share this podcast while joining us at the intersection of mindfulness and social change that challenges the status quo, awakens our collective wisdom, and creates a world with peace, clarity, and freedom. All right, welcome to the Mindful Rebel podcast. I'm excited to be here in conversation with Ethan Nichtern, Buddhist teacher and author. Ethan, thank you for joining me on this podcast episode. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me, Sean. It's great to be here.
Of course. I love technology because it allows us to sort of do the thing even when we're on the road. Folks who are familiar with the podcast are like, yeah, not all the anime pictures and stuff in the background here, but I was like, yeah, we can still do this. Throw in an AirPod and pull up the computer. So thanks for taking some time to be in conversation. I know prior to us getting started, I know you mentioned this is a busy time with the book being released. So we're going to talk about that. But I also, one of the things that's important for me is to like ground in like who you are, right? And I know that this, and every time I ask, like, what brought you to the work that you do? I know that can be a very big question. But I think it's an important question to sort of share. So, I know you several books as an author, you do a lot of work teaching Buddhism in several different spaces, including at Dharma Moon. I mean, I guess a great question is like, what brought you to the Buddhist path?
Yeah.
Now, that's a big one, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the probably the biggest shout out on what brought me to the path would have to go to my parents. That's not, they didn't force me to do it in any way, shape, or form. But so I grew up in New York City. Both of my parents were students of Chogyam Trungpa, he was the first Tibetan Buddhist teacher to teach very widely in the West and influenced a lot of different people in the kind of Western Buddhist world, what's now become the mindfulness movement. So both my parents were students of his from very early on in the 1970s, and that's how they met each other. So I grew up with it, but I grew up in New York City, went to very progressive, diverse private school. So I had that background. And I did a meditation class when I was 9 years old. There was a teacher in the Shambhala community who's one of my teachers later on, named Eric Spiegel. Bless him. He taught a group of kids how to meditate and had the patience to do that. So, but really got interested in it, got interested in reading Buddhist philosophy, like high school, and did like a weekend meditation retreat in high school that my dad actually taught. Was more interested in the philosophy. I mean, meditation practice, it's boring. You're working with your own mind. It's hard, but then in college, got dumped by I had my first girlfriend in college, and she dumped me after freshman year, and then I got really into meditation. So heartbreak was what like actually brought me to the path, and then just being interested in how Buddhism as a philosophy, mindfulness as a practice could relate to a wide range of modern life. I mean, I was really interested in social justice, from some of my early childhood education, but also right after I graduated college, 9/11 happened, and there's a lot of protests going on right now, and got really involved in protesting, the W presidency and unjust war, and have always been really interested in writing, and I'm not a musician but really interested in music, so really interested in what might be called dharma art, bridging creativity with I'm something of a fan of anime, and animated
Oh,
stuff. So I mean, not I'm probably sounds like if you have a lot of anime art, I haven't seen your specifics, but I bet you're more niche than I am. But yeah, my favorite. I watch it with my daughter too. My favorite cartoon of all time is Avatar: The Last Airbender. That's very, very,
classic,
very Buddhist
classic.
work. Yep.
It is. It is. It is. When I first watched it, I think when I was younger, it didn't. It was, but I think, and I know I rewatched the full series during the pandemic, and I was like, huh, it is a lot here that I did not pick up as a kid, like in terms of really sort of being rooted in like Buddhist philosophy and tradition. That there was so much there that I was like, I'm gonna have to watch this again with a fine tooth comb and take some more notes, but it's definitely there.
Yeah. Each of the four nations in which is all based on the four elements, for those of you who aren't, familiar with Avatar: The Last Airbender, is supposedly based on a different Asian society, and the airbenders or the air nomads are directly based on Tibetan Buddhist monks. So
Hmm.
that's why they all have Tibetan names, actually, except for Aang.
Right.
For some reason, Aang is not a Tibetan name. I don't know why.
Thank you for sharing that, Ethan. One of the things you mentioned, which I find fascinating, like I think you might be the first person I know that like was I maybe hooked on the philosophy before the meditation piece.
Mm-hmm.
What what was it about the philosophy that sort of hooked you? And then I guess part of that, I guess part two to my question is Buddhism has like a lot of lists and a lot of like a lot of interesting entry points into the philosophy. Was there a way that you approached it that helped simplify that for you, or was it the intricacies of Buddhist philosophy that was intriguing to you?
Yeah, it's a great question. And just want to give a shout out to the Dharma Moon's year-long Buddhist Studies program, because we go through both a lot of the different meditation practices, but a lot of the different philosophical and psychological lists. Um, yeah, so I mean, I had been introduced to meditation, right? And from the tradition, if you look at like the traditions of Zen or the traditions of historically Tibetan, or what's also called tantric Buddhism, meditation is really at the root of what you're not supposed to just be a philosopher. But especially when I started rereading like Thich Nhat Hanh and Chogyam Trungpa, not rereading at that point, it was reading Thich Nhat Hanh and Chogyam Trungpa in high school. I think what I liked is, I love that your podcast is called The Mindful Rebel. I like to argue, philosophy and kind of debate and argue. And I felt like, there was a lot of the world that was just being like, this is the way it is, and and I really like Buddhist philosophy because there was a philosophy that was both kind of clear about what it was presenting, but also kind of left a lot of room for you to contemplate, argue, and that combination, like it inspired me because there was a lot of clarity about like the nature of reality and impermanence and the fact that there's not a solid self, at the end of the day. But at the same time, it left enough room for me to have my own experience, and it wasn't trying to like shove something down my throat dogmatically. So, um, and then from that, I think I rediscovered, okay, like meditation, the philosophical side of this, they keep saying meditation's important. So then I kind of started committing a little bit more towards the end of high school to doing it regularly. And then it was really college that I was like, I'm a Buddhist.
Nice. Nice. Do you have any suggestions for folks that may be looking for an entry point into the Buddhist path, and are
Yeah.
trying to figure out, or maybe like, is this what I should be reading, or is this what I should be looking at? Like, yeah, any suggestions?
Yeah, there are a lot of lists. As a kind of overview book, my book, The Road Home, is really kind of a modern overview of some of the core Buddhist concepts and teachings. I really like, as an overview book, The Heart of the Buddha's Teachings by Thich Nhat Hanh, which goes through like a lot of the lists. But I mean, if there's one list, as an entry point to sort of study, read about, it's the Four Noble Truths. That's where the Buddhist path starts, with the truth of dissatisfaction, right? As this sort of, it's not trying to put necessarily, I mean, there are, when you look at the different cultures Buddhism went to, there's a lot of different spiritual narratives and premises, and we can talk about, divinity and God. And I think there's a lot of room for all those things in Buddhism. But the Buddha really considered himself almost like a doctor, or a
Mhm.
psychologist, just like, here is the problem, you know, here's the cause of the problem. This problem is, you can work with it, and here's how, and the Four Noble Truths really have that premise. So I think it's very clear. It sets the kind of traditions, what the tradition is trying to explain, very simply, but it does it in a way that's really clear but not dogmatic. The Buddha says, I'm here to work with the problem of dissatisfaction, or suffering. Dukkha is the word in the ancient languages. And there's a cause for that, which is certain ways that we cling to things that are not stable. uh it can be worked with, right? Which, that's, I mean, it's a very optimistic tradition, right? You can cease dissatisfaction, you can actually change your experience of life. And then the fourth noble truth is this whole, and this is where the list really begin, when it starts to get like kind of like the flower blooming and then it gets a little out of control, is the eightfold path, you know. And if you look at all of the different Buddhist teachings that come out of different traditions, I mean, then it's a 2,500-year tradition that was a spiritual and religious tradition, yes, but also was a deep existential philosophy tradition, and was a deep psychological and contemplative tradition. And so all of the different lists are kind of different ways of kind of growing out of that sense of, what is the path? What do we need to look at? What problems do we need to solve? What mind states do we get struck with? Do you get struck with, do you have anger issues? How do you work with jealousy? How do you work with addictive behaviors? How do you work with self-aggression or not liking oneself, etc.? And so I think that's where all the lists come from. And the reason there's so many lists historically is, they didn't have technology, right? So lists created kind of these categories of knowledge that you could hear a teaching, and memorization was a big part of the way it's like, okay, what are the six, right? The teacher said these six, and I just traveled a long way to hear this teacher speak, and now I'm going to have to go live my life and do my practice. What are those six? Like the six actions of a compassionate being or a bodhisattva, the six paramitas. So you go, all right, the first one was generosity, right? The second one was patience. What does that mean? And so there's this way of kind of treating oral knowledge and categorizing it in a way that your brain could recall it, and it's interesting. I mean, we live in this era where that form of knowledge, like, we don't really need it as much. I mean, I don't even remember, like, my best friend's phone number. I don't know if you, right?
I just thought about that the other day. I don't know why that came to my mind, but I was like, I just don't know phone numbers anymore. I remember when I was younger, I probably remember my mom and dad, but other than that, like numbers, and don't get me started on birthdays, because like if it wasn't for Facebook, I just would not know anybody's birthday. So, I, listen, you're right though. It's a lost skill. It's a lost skill that sometimes I think our smartphones made us forget that. Our computers made us sort of lose that.
Smartphone means the phone is smart, but the user becomes less smart by using it, right?
Right. One of the things I was going to ask you, Ethan, I know that your new book has recently released, Confidence, Holding Your Seed Through Life's Eight Worldly Winds. Now, one of the things I like to always ask authors is that, like, knowing that our books come from a very creative space, and often are birthed because there's maybe a societal need, or there was something that you felt needed to be sort of shared culturally, right? What was it that prompted development of confidence?
Yeah. It's a great question, and it's a funny, I acknowledge this in the introduction, like this moment in history, like, cisgendered straight white male tells you about confidence, might but it's something I've really struggled with throughout my life. And it's whenever I have conversations, I work with a lot of students one-on-one. I just talk to friends about these teachings. People ask for recommendations. I work with a lot of groups. I mean, whenever we get below the surface of interest in Buddhism or mindfulness, this usually comes up as a primary, how do I show up? How do I feel good about myself? How do I have confidence when I'm, you just did a meditation, or did a while ago, a meditation teacher training, right? So when I'm teaching others, right? Or when I'm on my podcast and my voice is, how do I have confidence that, like, what I'm putting out into the world, right? How do I have confidence in my relationships, etc.? And what do the teachings have to say about this? And I really wanted to explore that because I think they have a lot to say, even though I think a lot of people think that Buddhism is about like taking up less space and kind of retreating from the world. So there's this kind of irony and this tension between meditation and what people often think meditation is all about, and this idea of, no, this can actually help us show up more fully, more authentically, with more compassion, which I think is an incredibly important part of confidence, is how do we actually show up with compassion. And so I wanted to play with, like, what is my experience with confidence, and what do the teachings that I've inherited actually have to say about confidence, self-confidence, showing up to the difficulties in life.
Yeah, there was a few things that you mentioned, and it's interesting what you just shared. I'm the kind of person, whether it's a physical book or whether I'm on my iPad, I highlight. And there was one in the intro of the book, there was one sentence that I highlighted, and it was, I found that just below the initial set of attractions to Buddhist practice lurk questions of self-confidence and self-worth. And that sort of struck me. And as you were talking, I don't know if I thought about it from the perspective of what draws folks to the path of Buddhism is this idea of working with confidence and worth. And that one, I was like, huh, let me pause real quick and sort of journal on that a little bit more. And so you sort of touched on it, but like, how did you sort of synthesize that from your teachings and from your connection with people along your career of working with people as a teacher?
Yeah. Well, I think, it's interesting because everybody's looking for like a doorway into, like, how is this relevant? And obviously, when we talk about mindfulness, we talk about you know, basically paying attention to everything more, right? Being more mindful in the moment. And there's this sense of living a more fulfilling life through paying more attention, experiencing things more fully, living in the present moment, etc. And then you look at, like, so what are the problems where we're trying to solve? What do we actually, what is the nature of our confusion or our suffering? So the ways different people have taken that on, you know, I like, for example, one of the people who spread the idea of mindfulness really far in society, John Kabat-Zinn, through developing this program of stress reduction, right? 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction, which he has said publicly, like stress in that very secular medical course that he developed is his interpretation of dukkha or dissatisfaction. So that's his way of teaching the Four Noble Truths, is to frame it as, you're feeling a lot of stress. Here's how we can work with that. So, you know, we could talk about fear. We could talk about like, oh, I have issues with anger. You know, I need to chill out more, or whatever it is. So I think when you start talking to people, especially these days when we're in this space where I think there's a big component of this, where we're in this space where more of us are trying to have platforms or just voices, you know, just like, I just want to have the ability to share my voice and say something. Or, you know, where people are not really interested in these teachings so much as like, let me go do like a 12-year retreat. I mean, some people in my generation, like Lama Rod Owens, did a, you know, 3-year retreat. I've done multiple 1-month retreats, but that's, you know, it's always been, how do I return to the world, you know? And then it's like, all right, and now I have to ask somebody out, you know, or now I have to like try to get a book published. You know, that was a really interesting, my first book, that was a really interesting, like talking to the literary agent for the first time. Like, how do I actually show up to that? And then how do I maintain humble, but at the same time have a sense of like, I have something to say and it's okay to say it, you know? So whatever it is in our life, I think we're all trying to figure out, okay, I need to go within myself to get to know my mind and heart more. But when I come back out, there's actually something I want to show up to that is hard to do, you know, and I want to feel like it's okay that I'm doing that, you know, and I think we're all kind of, you know, other than the Donald Trumps and Kanye Wests among us. I mean, I love people who are stage performers because they seem like they're super confident, you know, but even rap stars need hype men, right? So clearly they don't feel completely confident. Right? we all struggle with this, you know. But for most of us, this is this question of like, all right, sometimes I feel like an imposter, you know. Sometimes I don't know if I have anything to say. Sometimes this is going to be hard, and I would rather just go, you know what, I'll go hide in a cave for 3 years rather than really actually say, I'm going to figure out how to show up. And so I just, the more conversations, the more this sense of, do I have permission to do this? How do I do this authentically? How do I do this in a way that doesn't turn me into a bloated narcissist? Like, those were the questions that people want to talk about when our conversation shifted from the mechanics of meditation to, okay, here's this life issue I'm trying to deal with as a Buddhist, or as a, not even a Buddhist, but like as a person who's trying to wake up more, you know?
Yeah. I want to say thank you for naming that. And it's one of the through lines I've been sort of looking at the teachers that I gravitate to. And I see this like with you, I see this with your dad, David, and particularly with the work that's happening with Dharma Moon, that there's a practicality to the approach around like acknowledging that we are like in the world, and like how do we navigate in the world with this different level of awareness based on the teachings, right? That it doesn't seem like, and I know that there feels like sometimes there's some approaches where it feels very separate,
Mm-hmm.
and not necessarily leaning into how is this practical for me to live in a day-to-day life with the way the world is, and sort of fully show up. So I appreciate you naming that as you shared that just now. It's I think it's something that's really important. I think it's also a way to sort of help folks connect to it more, because I think sometimes there's this idea like, okay, cool, I get it. I see what's here in the teachings. What does that mean? Like, how do I practically use this or pick this up and use this in my daily life once I close this book? And so I appreciate that the the emphasis that this is something that really allows us to show up, and knowing how we show up with ourselves and those around us. I want to, when I looked at, and I was like, this is just the mindfulness meditation meditation teacher training sort of ingrained in my mind. But immediately from the title, the holding your seat, I immediately went to like take your seat. And so I thought it was funny as soon as like the intro was take your seat. And I appreciated that approach that like us taking our seat is this idea of sort of like being present to what's around us. Was it, I guess, where did it click for you to sort of bring that in as like this like almost like a double entendre about using like take your seat? I thought that was really impactful.
Yeah. I mean, take your seat, I think always. So take your seat again, if you're just working with mindfulness meditation, that is especially in, the tradition that like my dad comes from, Chogyam Trungpa and the Shambhala tradition. There is this double entendre because it's both just this postural moment where you sit down, you check in, and it could happen at the beginning of meditation, it could happen in the middle of meditation where you check in with your posture. And there's certain elements of good meditation posture, although I think the most important thing is just to end up comfortable, but with a uplifted kind of being. And there's reasons we want to try to sit with a long spine. So arranging one's posture and all the details of that is the kind of functional meaning of take your seat. But there was this metaphor too in the Shambhala teachings of taking your seat being, because the Shambhala came from this idea of a mythological Himalayan kingdom, enlightened society. So the image that we were often given for taking our seat is pretend you are the king or queen of Shambhala, sitting on your throne. So there's this sense of like almost there's an image or a metaphor of like claiming your spot at the center of your own life when you take your meditation seat. I mean, I'm not really into monarchy personally. I prefer democracy, but that idea, like, what is the image for us where we can say, I'm claiming my spot, and this is the spot I sit in to show up fully with dignity and with confidence in my life, right? If we were, I mean, your hat has a crown on it. I love it, right? So if you were really the king, right, how would you show up? And you were a compassionate king, how would you show up? You wouldn't, I mean, if you were a sloppy king who didn't care about being king, you might show up. Or if you were a really fragile king, but if you were a real dignified and awakened leader, how would you show up? And the idea is that we are all that in our life, right? So take your seat. I don't go that deep into it, but that was the metaphor. And then when things happen in our life, or when things happen in meditation, thoughts intervene, mind's really, really messy. We have really strong emotions. We want to get up from our meditation seat. The idea of holding one seat is, how do we stay with that, right? Not pretend it's not happening, not just, like try to mantra it away, but just like, how do I actually hold my seat with whatever my mind is doing right now?
Thank you. I feel like that's a really great transition to the next question. You know, the book is framed around like the eight worldly winds, right? Can you talk a little bit about that concept, for maybe folks who may be new to that idea, and sort of maybe what around the teachings of the eight worldly winds made sense to sort of frame this conversation around confidence?
Yeah, I've always liked the eight worldly winds. So this is one of the lists that go back to this one actually starts with the Buddha. There's a lot of lists in Buddhism that come from teachers and traditions long after the Buddha, but this one actually goes back to the Buddha. It's sometimes called the vicissitudes, which means like highs and lows, right? The extremes. That's the way Sharon Salzberg talks about it. But it's basically these four pairs, right? And there's a positive side and a negative side. There's a high and a low. And when we look at them as winds, these are like the forces that the world throws at us again and again and again. And so on the most kind of primal level of just our body and our nervous system, it's pleasure and pain. Then it's praise and criticism. then it's fame, and it's disrepute in some versions of this. But I feel like we're in an era where disrepute is kind of another kind of fame. You become like the anti-hero. So I like what it is, insignificance, right? That we really fear. So fame and insignificance, and then success and failure, the most general sense of these pairs of what we hope for and what we fear. And life and our mind constantly throw us experiences of these highs and lows again and again and again. And maybe some days we get more of the pain, and less of the pleasure, maybe some lifetimes, actually, sadly. Maybe some days we get more of the praise. We've all had those days where it's like, oh, everybody's feeling me right now. And then we get criticism. And so we go back and forth, and the life just keeps throwing these highs and lows at us. These hopeful and feared winds just keep knocking us while we're trying to hold our seat in the middle of our life. And so I've always liked this list because it felt so real. It's so, a guy 2,600 years ago in India came up with these. They still completely apply. And I really wanted to write a long chapter on working with each of them, because Buddhist teachers have named them in things that I've read in the modern era, but nobody's gone really deep into them in a way that's like, okay, how does our quest for recognition actually work in the social media era? How do pleasure and pain work with the various addictive tendencies that a human might have right now? How do we work with jealousy when somebody around us is successful and we're not? So I wanted to really kind of take those on. I've always really liked that list, and I never saw a piece of writing that was really in depth about them. And so this metaphor kind of developed the notion of take your seat, hold your seat, and working with wind, forces knocking us around, and how do we actually show up anyway, not expecting the wind to necessarily die down. That was kind of a compelling way to build the idea of the book, because there isn't in classic Buddhism like one teaching, here's how to be confident, or here's how to practice confidence. If that existed, I would just be like, read this.
Yeah, listen, thank you for sharing that. And I appreciate you naming that too, the idea that like there isn't a lot written about it. And I remember, I think I came across this a few years ago, and the concept of the eight world, I was like, this is really fascinating. And I feel like I was trying to do all this research, and I was like, I really can't find a lot. I just see that it's a thing, but in terms of like a detailed discourse around it, there isn't a lot. So I was so fascinated and excited when I saw that your book was like tackling that, because I found the concept of winds and sort of this juxtaposition of these two ends, something that we're working with constantly, something that felt really practical and useful for us.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I think a reason there might not be so much is the Buddha, the historical Buddha, he wasn't really that into the world. Like he really did set up his teachings in a way that the spiritual path was set against life in the world. And he totally talked to what, worldly people who stayed, what he called them householders, right? But the serious practitioners in his worldview were the ones who kind of left the world behind, joined the monastic sangha, became yogis, and really devoted themselves to contemplation and meditation. So we're trying to look at how to build this life as a mindfulness practitioner where you're really engaging the world. And it is, he was such a serious practitioner that his teachings on the mind are always really helpful. But his teachings on how to engage in the world, he might not be the right person. He had a pretty, if I was like a modern psychologist, if you know anything about like attachment styles or attachment theory,
Mm,
he had an avoidant attachment style.
mm,
And for those of us with more worldly or secure or anxious attachment styles, we might like actually need teachings on how to engage with these worldly winds. His teachings were a little bit more like you need to know these are going to happen if you enter the world, and try not to be swayed by them, right?
Hmm. No, Ethan, I always like to ask this question for folks, especially folks like you who are leaders in the Buddhist space and mindfulness. Um, the idea, the concept, the connection to mindfulness feels like probably more popular than ever. I feel like, especially in the last few years. And I think there's always something great about a concept or idea gaining that sort of popularity, because I always feel like there's a new level of access to it, right? More and more people are connecting to it. And also, I think sometimes it can run away and expand in different ways. And so, as somebody who's a leader in the space, is there anything that, as mindfulness continues to expand its reach and its connection, that we need to keep in mind, that we need to ensure that we don't let that aspect of it get away, right? Like, is there something that you feel like, hey, we need to make sure that we stay centered around this idea, concept of like mindfulness in general?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It is more um popular than ever, and I think that's the first thing to notice, because there are a lot of criticisms of it becoming more and more popular, like, becoming more part of like a capitalist space, or which could just mean people are trying to make a living as they work with it, which is not, that could be a democratic socialist process just happening in a capitalist space. uh Sometimes some criticism is that there's a co-option of other cultures in it, which, I think there's some validity to those criticisms if the person doesn't kind of, it's always important to understand lineage and ancestries and say, like, okay, what am I receiving from who did they receive it from? And I think that's part of the chain of the meditative knowledge and wisdom of really having this sense of connection to lineage, right? Like, my teachers were these folks and this was their experience and they got this from these folks, and knowing what we're part of, I think is the main way to avoid that sort of co-opting somebody else's culture. um and the other thing I'll say, because there's a lot of conversation going on, there was this term developed like 10 years ago, mick mindfulness, right? You want to like avoid this sort of like cheap fast food version of mindfulness. I mean, making something accessible, though, that's, if somebody has an app and they're using an app, um I think that's great. I don't think it's the be all end all. I think we need community. So I think that's a huge part of what we need to keep in mind. Sangha, or community, is so kind of necessary. The other piece is that the mindfulness as a set of practices and ideas about how to pay attention in the present moment and what the present moment means, that's part of the Noble Eightfold Path. It's only one of the eight. And they weren't actually, this is, I think, the best way to frame this criticism. They weren't actually meant to be chopped up, and I think what happened is, because Buddhism is considered a spiritual tradition, there's so much that is psychologically and in a secular sense relevant about the Buddhist teachings, that people like John Kabat-Zinn, or like a lot of other people, said, what is the most kind of usable portions of this wisdom that can enter a more secular conversation? And that was mindfulness. But when you really get into the other seven, it's just about looking at reality, and it's about ethics. It's about how we treat ourselves, how we treat others, how we engage in the system that we're sharing. And I think those teachings are really important, contemplating, what not stealing means, to contemplate what it means to practice refraining from killing, as we're living in a world of war, et cetera, right now, and violence, and so forth. So I do think if we really practice mindfulness, though, it leads us in our own way to the other elements of the path. So I'm not particularly worried about it. And I'm actually pretty grateful even to people who've kind of taken these teachings and made them a little bit more superficial. I think that's okay. Like every time I hear a reference to meditation just on Netflix, in a way that I'm like, that person isn't actually ever going to meditate. It's just a line in that show. I'm actually grateful because somebody will probably meditate, and also, I think these ideas need to be taught differently in different cultures too. And I think we need people who inhabit different cultural spaces presenting them. So if everybody's inhabiting the same cultural or the same social location, that would be a real limitation. There's a real sense of actually sharing in the ways it can be shared. And I think no two teachers should look quite the same or act quite the same in doing that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Um, and I love the idea that like the cultural context like matters how the teachings are being shared, and I don't know if I hear that as often. Um, but it sort of that made me pause and think a little bit more intentionally. 'Cause it's like, how do the teachings help us meet the times that we're in?
Yeah.
In a much more dynamic, and I keep going back to this idea of taking your seat, like to fully be present with what's happening in the world around us. So thank you for naming that. There's as we start to wrap up, there's one question I like to ask, and I know typically we get a lot of practitioners and teachers that listen to this podcast. Um, Based on your years of experience, are there any maybe tips that you have for folks who are holding space and teaching meditation and mindfulness to other folks?
Yeah, I mean, I think teaching is an interesting path. When I started teaching, which was 2001, 2002, I was 23, 24 years old. And basically my intention then was I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to be a writer, but I couldn't figure out how to do that. And my experience being in the different Buddhist communities I was part of is there weren't hardly any young people, never mind other forms of lack of diversity. So most people were of my parents, the boomer generation. So I was really interested in, because it really had helped me work with depression in college and things like that, in working with young folks and just trying to figure out how to do that, and I think it's great if you can do it through kind of established means. I did some of it through the Shambhala community, which had very clear curriculum and different ways of doing it. But sometimes, and I think to reach a new audience, when I taught outside, I'd have to build curriculum. I'd have to say like, okay, I have, these 2 hours for a drop-in class. Like, who's going to come? I don't know. How should we structure it? Should we meditate and have a Dharma talk? Should it be more interactive? Like, how should we all sit? Should we sit in a circle? Should we, sit in rows, etc.? Should there be food there? So what I would say, and that, that's 2002, that I started doing that. So never mind, like, what is Zoom? How should I structure? Like, I'm going to run a Zoom group, or I'm going to do like an Instagram live thing or whatever. We really have to think about like, what's the structure going to be? And I think just trying it and seeing. And sometimes the best way to start, if we don't have any connections, is just like invite a few friends over and be like, okay, I'm doing this teacher training, like the Dharma Moon's mindfulness meditation teacher training. Can I use y'all as guinea pigs? Or I need a better name than guinea pig. When I've taught teacher trainings, I've actually said your homework is to find like a friend in your life to be your guinea pig and say, can I just give you the meditation instruction? I was like, your other homework is to find a better term for that person than guinea pig.
Yeah, listen,
Every
thank
other
you for
term I
sharing.
came up with was worse. But can I just have a few friends over and like,
Yeah.
can I just guide us all in a meditation, and then maybe we could talk about this, and then maybe we could have some food or go out for drinks, or whatever the situation is. Um, or you could say, all right, you know what, I'm going to throw up my group. Or I think when we're already working in a space that is kind of like Dharma adjacent, let's say you're like a yoga teacher, or you're, a therapist, it's a little easier to say like, okay, what if I added some mindfulness meditation in here? Or what if I started using more references from these teachings, but I think it's very much trial and error, and you have to be willing. This is where confidence comes in. You have to be willing to try again and again, and be really willing for things not to work. Those first few years that I was teaching outside of Shambhala, I taught one class Thursday nights in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, at 8:15 p.m., which, if you're familiar with Williamsburg, Brooklyn, in the Aughties, that's where the term hipster revived itself, was specifically in that neighborhood. And 8:15 on a Thursday night, you may as well be teaching mindfulness in a bar, so I didn't know who was going to come. Some weeks 3 people came, some weeks 20 people came, and then I would ride the highs and lows of that. And sometimes the best things happen when 3 people came, so we just have to try things and see how they go.
Yeah. That's a beautiful piece of wisdom to share with folks. It's like, and I love the tie back in. It's like, it's confidence to try, right? Like, try and notice what the iterative process is around that. I appreciate that. That's something I often get hung up on, because I think, we think so often about like things need to be perfect or look a specific way. And it's like, no, it's okay with things being a rough draft, and figuring it out, as you go and move through.
Yeah. That's something I learned from writing books too, is I let my first draft of the book be rougher these days, because I know I've gained a lot of experience in knowing how many rounds of edits the book is going to go through anyway. Whereas, the first time I write a book, I know this with a lot of people, the first time they write a book, it's like, my rough draft has to be perfect. And it's like, no, it's just going to get chopped up anyway. Like, send some good raw meat to get chopped up. Don't try to send like your perfect plate of food. And I think teaching has a little bit of that quality. Like, it should, each time you do it, each time you work with the same curriculum or the same workshop or whatever it is, the presentation can get a little bit tighter, or you can update or shift things or evolve them. But you got to start by trying. That's, I think, the core message in everything with the book is confidence is a practice, and the only way to do it is to take your seat and just be like, all right, let's try this.
Listen, Ethan, thank you for taking the time out to chat. This has been like a great conversation. How can folks get in contact with you? How can folks connect with you? I know that the book is out. Where can they find the book? And can you talk a little bit about some of the other work that you do that might be of interest to the audience?
Of course. Thank you. Yeah. So Confidence, the book, is out, I think, everywhere. I love indie bookstores. So if that's an option for you, please do it. And and it's also out on audio and on e-reader and all that stuff. I have my own podcast that comes out weekly, The Road Home, which is named after my earlier book. EthanNichtern.com. You can get on my email list. We don't send you too terribly much stuff. And then Dharma Moon is the main place I teach group stuff. And the main group course that I teach is the year-long Buddhist Studies program, which goes in modules. The full year starts every year in late January. But you can also join for individual 6-week course modules. So dharmamoon.com would be more info about that.
Perfect. Everything that Ethan just shared, it'll be down in the description section of the podcast, or if you're on YouTube, the description section there too. Ethan, thank you. Thank you for taking some time out. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Of course.
Hey, Rebels. Thank you for joining us on another episode of the Mindful Rebel podcast. Remember, after this listen, ask yourself where wisdom can meet practice and where compassion can meet action. Take a moment today to reflect on what resonated with you in this episode. Now, if you're feeling that rebel spirit, I'd invite you to like and share this episode. Your support helps spread the message of mindfulness, self-inquiry, and self-discovery. And if you're feeling extra generous, and I know you are, leave a rating and a review of the podcast. It helps others find this resource on their own mindfulness journey. May you move into the rest of your day with a greater sense of peace, clarity, and freedom.